Okay friends, it's time to get started on our job. One of the first things you want to do is safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so the wheel's off the ground. After that, we're going to go ahead and remove the center cover. Typically, if you were to look along the rim and the center cover, you're going to find a little cutout. Carefully get in between there without damaging the wheel and gently pry this off. We'll just give it a quick inspection. You can set that aside, and now we can move along to removing all 5 of our 19mm lug nuts and then the wheel. Now that we have the wheel out of the way, we have a nice clear view of our outer tie rod end and our inner tie rod end. Let's continue on to this area right here. This is considered your jam nut. It holds the inner tie rod end and the outer tie rod end together. I'm going to use a 21mm wrench. We'll put this right onto the jam nut and we're going to turn this clockwise to loosen it up. Once that's broken free, continue on to the outer tie rod end nut. Now sometimes on this nut you might happen to find that it has a cotter pin. If it does, just go ahead and remove it. If it doesn't, use your 21mm socket to remove the nut. Now you can separate the outer tie rod end from the knuckle. Let's continue on by removing the outer tie rod end from the inner tie rod end. To do that, we're going to go ahead and turn this counterclockwise. While we're doing it, we're going to go ahead and count the amount of rotations it takes to remove it. 1, 2, and so on. All right, once you have that number, go ahead and write it down. Let's move along to removing the jam nut from the inner tie rod end. To do that, I'm going to go ahead and hold on to the shaft of the inner tie rod end and then remove the nut. Now we can start removing the bellows boot from the inner tie rod end. Now for the bellows boot, you're going to have 2 clamps. One of them is typically reusable right on the outside here. It has a couple ears, you can grab onto it and slide it right off. Of course, you'd want to give it a quick inspection, make sure it is reusable. If it isn't, you can continue on using a wire tie. Now for the inner clamp, it's going to be located right in between the power steering rack and the frame. You can go ahead and knock this out of position using a pry bar and a hammer. It is not reusable. Now once you have both of the clamps freed up, let's continue on by grabbing onto the boot and we're going to give it a little tug. What you're going to find is you do have one single crossover tube that goes from one side over here of the bellows boot all the way over to the other side. That's okay. We're just going to go ahead and pull the boot right off of it. Give it a little twist, pulling it towards me. Go ahead and remove that boot and then give it an inspection. You want to make sure it's soft and pliable and it doesn't look like it's torn or worn or damaged in any way. Let's grab that clamp out of there. There's the ridge that I went ahead and hit up against, and I broke it free. Now at this point, let's go ahead and turn the steering wheel in the direction of the inner tie rod that you're going to be replacing. If you're doing the right side, turn to the right. Once you have the wheel turned, you have a nice clear access to the rest of the inner tie rod end. Looking down at the inboard aspect of it, you can see that there's an area that you should be able to grab onto with a wrench. I have an inner tie rod end tool. Essentially, I'm just going to go ahead and go right over this area here, and I'll tighten it up. Then I'll turn this counterclockwise and unscrew it from the power steering rack. Once it's broken free, typically I remove my tool. Now we can unscrew the inner tie rod end from the power steering rack. There it is, friends. Okay, friends, now it's time to install our brand new inner tie rod end. Let's get this in position up against the power steering rack. We'll bottom this out by hand. Okay, so right there it feels as though it's bottomed out. At this point, I only want to take it a little bit further. Essentially, I want to make sure that it's completely tight, but also you want to pay attention and make sure you're not twisting the power steering rack internally. Remove your tool. Now that we have the inner tie rod end nice and tight, the next thing you're going to want to do is pack the joint with some of the supplied grease. The joint is this area right here. Essentially, you can wobble this around to work the grease in as needed. Now let's take some more of that grease and we're going to come right along the shaft right here, essentially right where that bellows boot's supposed to ride. This is going to help the alignment professional in the end. Now it's going to be time to put on our power steering bellows boot. Now for this, like I said, the clamp was a single time use. Just go ahead and use a wire tie. Slide that right on over the end. Now once I have it over that, I'm going to continue on by putting this onto the power steering rack. You want to make sure you have this area mounted onto the tube that goes along the front of the power steering rack as you slide this into position. There we are. Now I'm going to straighten out the wheel. All right, at this point, I have the boot slid completely onto the power steering rack and, of course, that little tube. Now I'm just going to go ahead and tighten up my wire tie, and then I'll trim off the excess. Put on your spring clamp. Now let's apply some copper never seize to the threaded area. Time for the new jam nut. Now let's grab our new outer tie rod end. Now it's time to install our outer tie rod end. Now when we install this, it's important to make sure that you put it back on the same amount of threads as it took to remove it. Now once you have it back in the proper position, go ahead and put the jam nut right against the outer tie rod end. Let's put the outer tie rod end into the knuckle. Put on your castle nut. Now let's bottom this out. Now let's torque this to 52 foot-pounds. The next thing you're going to want to do is make sure that one of the slots on your nut is going to line up with the hole in the stud. If for some reason it does not line up, you need to continue tightening the nut until the very next slot does. After you have it through, go ahead and pin it over so it locks the nut in place. Let's move up to the jam nut. For this, you want to make sure it's nice and tight up against that outer tie rod end. Make sure that's tight. Now the next thing you want to do is make sure that the outer tie rod end is parallel to the ground. If it seems like it's a little off kilter, just go ahead and grab onto it with something and then just give it a little twist until it is parallel. Let's just double check everything to make sure it's nice and tight. Now it's time to get the wheel up on here. Let's go ahead and start on all 5 of our 19mm lug nuts. After that, we can bottom them out, get the wheel back on the ground, and then we'll torque each of them to 100 foot-pounds. Now we can torque the lug nuts in a crisscross manner. Torqued. Of course, if you do have a center cover, go ahead and put that on now. Paying attention to the back, you can see 5 slots. They line up with 5 lug nuts. Line it up, bonk it in position. Okay friends, we got our front end back together. What's left to do now? Now, whenever you do any type of front end work, it's important to make sure that you go down and get yourself a 4-wheel alignment. Thanks for watching.